Hello everybody, my name is Professor Bruno Silva, and on today's video we'll be discussing the impacts of voluntary feed intake on lactating sows' performance. Lactating sows require energy and amino acids for maintenance and for milk production. These requirements, or the establishment of these requirements, are based on their body weight, on the milk production yield and milk composition, as well as the environmental conditions under which these animals are housed. Although establishing the ideal nutritional requirements on a daily basis is a difficult task, it is estimated that around 80% of total daily requirements are for milk production and around 20% for maintenance. To calculate this nutrient demand for milk production, normally we have to take into account the number of piglets and the litter weight gain during the lactation. However, new concepts have been adopted for a better estimation of milk production and efficiency of energy for such productivity. The growth of the mammary gland during lactation affects the amount of milk produced by the sows and consequently the growth rate of the piglets. Thus, the nutritional management adopted during lactation should focus on maximizing mammary gland growth. This mammary gland development is impacted by the consumption of amino acids and energy intake during lactation. We also have to consider that the requirement for each additional piglet is larger than the current accumulation rates of nutrients by tissues. This means that the current nutritional programs are not ideal for the growth rate of the mammary gland, especially for these high-producing sows, which have larger litters and more active mammary glands. For the sow to support an increasing number of piglets during lactation, it's extremely important to keep them in a proper body condition. Generally, feed intake during lactation is not sufficient to sustain an adequate milk production and maintain large litters. If higher energy and amino acid demands cannot be met via extra feed intake, the sow is forced to mobilize its body reserves. Excessive mobilization can become a problem, especially for subsequent litter performance and even the longevity of the sows. So therefore, it becomes necessary to focus on lactational performance, increasing energy efficiency during lactation, leading to increased milk production with a given consumption and mobilization of body reserves. Understanding the sow's voluntary feed intake is highly relevant if we want to establish a balance between productivity and body condition at weaning. So this means that we have to understand which are the main factors that will impact on voluntary feed intake. So for instance, you can have the effect of the individual. You might have inside a farrowing room sows that will present an ideal feed intake pattern, sows that will show a feed intake below its potential, and you'll have sows that will show metabolic disorders during the lactation phase. So this means that understanding the factors that will impact on voluntary feed intake can help us probably correct or determine strategies to try to improve this intake under these challenging situations. Another aspect that we have to consider is the genotype. We know that there are differences between genotypes. So you will have sows, for instance, that have a higher feed intake capacity than other sows. So this is also a factor that has to be considered. And last, we have to consider also the effect of the environment. We know that the environment is a limiting factor for efficient pig production under temperate and tropical conditions. So understanding that under heat stress conditions, the sow will reduce its feed intake as a mechanism to reduce the thermal effect of feed and therefore maintain its homeothermy is highly relevant, so that we can try to establish strategies to attenuate the negative impacts of this reduced feed intake. But one interesting thing that we have to take into account is that the impact of the climate, as you can see in the graph where we studied and we evaluated the daily feed intake curve according to the season, you have to consider that basically the impact of the environment starts after the second week. The first week, the sows are still at a low production level because this is mainly driven by the piglets. But after the second week of lactation, where the piglets start going into or start demanding more from the sow, then actually the sow needs to produce more milk, which will of course result in a higher heat production. Then the environment becomes a limiting factor, and then you will see that this animal will adjust not only its productivity but its feed intake as a mechanism to thermoregulate itself. And therefore, this animal will tend to show a lower feed intake pattern throughout lactation under these stressful conditions. The establishment of an ideal feed intake capacity of the sows inside our barns can be easily used as a tool to improve the efficiency of feed formulation. So this means that if I know the nutritional requirements of the sow and I know how much the sow is capable of eating, we can easily adjust the feed composition of the diet. So for instance, if I have a sow that has a daily need of 63 grams of lysine per day, but she's only capable of eating 5.6, this means that my diet needs 1.12% of lysine. But if I have a feed intake of around 7 kilos per day, this changes completely my feed formulation. This means that I need a diet with 0.9% of digestible lysine. As take-home messages, we have to remember that modern sows have high nutritional demands for milk production, as these animals have larger litters and more active mammary glands. We also have to understand that feed intake is one of the main driving factors for productivity. So understanding which factors will impact on voluntary feed intake are highly relevant. As we mentioned, genetics, temperature, and the effect of the individual. If this sow is not capable of reaching its daily needs based on its feed intake, this means that there is a big risk that we'll have an excessive body weight loss with consequently negative impacts on subsequent litter performance and longevity of this animal.